Welcome. I'm Stephanie Pell. I'm a professor at West Point and the Cyber Ethics Fellow at the Army Cyber Institute. And we are very fortunate today to have three distinguished panelists who many of us read on a weekly basis here to discuss journalism and cyber conflict. We will talk about some of the challenges faced by journalists and analysts who cover and write about cyber conflict in its many forms, which are today some of the most compelling stories that we are all following. So a few weeks ago, I saw something on Twitter, and I wrote it down thinking about the three of you. Journalism. It's a tough job with insane pressure and pretty crappy pay. On the other hand, everybody hates you. I hope your lived experience isn't quite that bad. So our panelists, Shane Harris from the Wall Street Journal, David Sanger from the New York Times, Susan Hennessy, who is executive editor of the Lawfare blog and also a former National Security Agency attorney. So I'd like to start by having each of you kind of introduce yourselves. Talk about what you do, what you write about, what issues and stories relating to cyber conflict that you are following and writing about in your roles as investigative journalist, analyst, and even editor. So Shane, if we can start with you.
That tweet's not true. The pay's not terrible. But everybody hates you. My dad doesn't follow me on Twitter, though, so that's okay. Well, thank you for having us and having a chance to talk about what we do every day, which is always fun. I would say that, for me in covering cyber, I mean, I came to that subject not long after 9/11, and sort of my indoctrination to it was kind of in the spirit of that time when many of the same people who had been in the White House warning about Al-Qaeda and international terrorism kind of saw an opportunity to say, there's this other thing that we should be worried about too, with bad things happening on the internet and to infrastructure and things that are hooked up to it. So it's been kind of a long progression from very early days where not a lot of people were thinking about this to where we now have more of a sort of public kind of fluency in the ideas of what cyber conflict looks like, or where people are starting to get more of a traction around that. But these days, specifically what I'm writing about is the Russia investigation. And so specifically with regards to the topic of this panel, very much looking at what exactly it was that the Russian government did and the intelligence community believes they did around the elections, what might happen in future elections, and of course what the scope and the flow of the investigation into possible coordination or not is. So it's been interesting because I do feel as a reporter, a lot of the things that I was talking to people about in the run-up to the election, even going back years, this idea that a nation state could use the power of information or disinformation to sort of shape world events. Of course, that wasn't new and that wasn't unique to what happened in the 2016 election. It was just the first time that we had confronted it in our own process and so up close and personal. So it's a very fun story to cover in that respect. It's very exciting, often sometimes very troubling, but it does feel like something I've been kind of, prepped for it to some extent.
David?
Well, when I started off working for the Times, I was actually covering the birth of the personal computer business. Hung out with Steve Jobs the week that he was bringing out the Macintosh and covering IBM's personal computer business and all that, and was working in the business section of the paper. And then after many other interesting stories, including the Space Shuttle Challenger investigation, which was a story the Times broke about what the causes of the explosion were, I went off to Japan to be the technology correspondent there, and then went on to be bureau chief. So technology has been a combination of two different fascinations I've had, one in new technologies, and the second in foreign affairs issues, global foreign affairs issues. And so as I came back to Washington, and I'm now in year 23 of a 3-year assignment, which is the other thing about journalism you forgot to put in your list there, right? I got more and more fascinated in how technology was affecting the major foreign policy decisions that the United States and other nations were confronting. And that all seemed to come together as I was working on a book called The Inheritance, which was about what George W. Bush left for Barack Obama. And there's a chapter in the book at the end that describes some of the cyber challenges ahead and the efforts by a few, including the Director of National Intelligence, Mike McConnell, under Bush, to get the government ready for all of this. And it wasn't, I guess, a year and a half after that book came out, maybe 2 years, that we began to see this odd virus spread around the world that people were calling Stuxnet. And I had covered the Iranian nuclear program pretty intensely, and it became pretty clear to me what it was that this virus was intended to do. And this was the first real use that we could discover of a state using a sophisticated cyber weapon in order to have real-world effects and to be able to try to achieve a diplomatic outcome, which was stall the Iranian program. Wasn't the only way they were trying to stall it, sanctions and other things, so that they could begin to get a real negotiation going. And that turned out to be a 2.5-year investigation that resulted in a lot of description in the next book, which was called Confront and Conceal, about how the Bush administration and the Obama administration had made the decisions to go use this weapon, and their fears that it would open the way for other countries to be able to go do that as well. And from that moment on, we were really sort of off and running. Even though we had run series before that in the Times on offensive cyber, nothing captures people like a real live example of what that was about. And as Shane indicated, it's only grown more fascinating because unlike so many other weapons, including nuclear weapons, cyber is one you can actually use, dial up, dial down, try to gauge what the reaction of another country is going to be. And watching countries stumble their way toward that and stumble their way toward the kind of deterrence issues that Joe Nye was discussing in the previous session is really, I think, at the most interesting corner of technology and national security today.
Susan.
So I am not a journalist like Shane and David. I'm sort of, I guess, analyst, or I'm a fellow at Brookings. And what sort of Lawfare's approach to these issues is, it comes from a little bit of a secondary space, which is providing the law and policy analysis based on stories that the two of you have reported, really sort of focused on a government and academic audience. Sort of, okay, we know these things are happening. How should we be thinking about them? How does the law apply? Sort of, what are the policy considerations here? So we come sort of to this issue a little bit with a little bit of a different perspective, but not unlike the sort of the experiences you've described. I think what we've found is that cyber is part of everything now. So it's part of domestic terrorism investigations. We sort of have seen over the past 2 years kind of the going dark encryption debate. It's certainly central to the debate about surveillance authorities, and not sort of debates that had used to sort of occur just in the national security space, sort of among a kind of wonky community, separate and apart from things like corporate interests. Suddenly, sort of the cross-platform elements of this has really required having conversations and considering the equities of large technology companies. And so really what we've seen is that there is no issue in which sort of this isn't a salient feature, if not the salient feature. And especially as we're starting to sort of approach the question of legal analysis and policy analysis, we're also finding is that you have to take a really wide look at the universe in order to understand things that might affect your world. So I focus a lot on sort of issues of encryption. And one of the things I came to learn of this past year is that if I wasn't looking at prosecutions related to child exploitation, I wasn't going to know what was coming next, because there weren't enough cases in federal courts regarding sort of terrorists. It was all occurring in this other space. And so this is an area in which you really, if you want to cover it comprehensively, if you don't want to be surprised, if you sort of want to understand the trends and directions, you have to have a really wide aperture, which makes it daunting to write about and think about this area, but also sort of really exciting. You can be working, you can go way down a rabbit hole and sort of one day and move to the next thing, pretty rapidly. And so it's an exciting thing to think about. It's a really challenging space, but I think really it's just that what is so overwhelming is kind of just the sheer breadth of it.
Agreed. So with that in mind, I'd like to start with a premise. The fourth estate in this country has traditionally referred to the free press, now perhaps the news media, in its role as a segment of society outside the political system that nevertheless wields indirect but significant influence on that system by informing the public. And as such, we've usually thought of the fourth estate as having an essential informative function in our democratic process. But thanks to the internet, we now live in a time when non-traditional journalistic media outlets, such as small for-profit media organizations, nonprofit media organizations, academic centers, and distributed networks of individuals participate in the media process with the larger news media organizations like the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. And it's certainly fair to say that these smaller, less traditional media outlets enhance and contribute to the process of informing the public. But, especially of late, we've also seen examples of media not seeking to inform the public, but rather directly to influence the public's political choices. One might say that sometimes such media outlets deploy techniques and data available to modern online advertising in an effort to target specific demographics in the population. Moreover, we see charges from the highest levels of government that traditional media outlets are purveyors of fake news, as that phrase has been applied to efforts by a foreign actor to influence our last national election. So, with that premise, with that lead up, how is the traditional fourth estate view challenged by the contemporary media environment? And has the ideal of objectivity, understanding there's never perfect objectivity, but has the ideal of objectivity that underwrote the traditional role of the fourth estate expressed through large media outlets been displaced by a more radically subjective ideal enabled by the internet, where everyone can be a reporter or an analyst unto him or herself?
Well, some observations on that. And to some extent, the breadth of what you've covered there kind of encapsulates the profound anxiety that has been, omnipresent in my career as a journalist when I began my reporting career in the late 1990s for a small publication here in Washington. And to give you an idea of how they were viewing the internet at that time, I was hired for this job, specifically I was told because I was a recent college graduate who knew how the internet worked. And the editors had great belief in the potential for the internet as a research tool. So this was truly being viewed as something we were going to use to go look up information to inform articles that would appear in print, and maybe we would also run them on a website. And really ever since then, throughout my career, there's always been this tremendous angst over what it is, what are we supposed to be doing as traditional publishers in the realm of digital publishing? How do we make that distinction between print and digital? What does it mean that anyone can have a website, anyone can have a blog? And I would say kind of as we went through like the early and mid 2000s, and there was really this proliferation of, I think, this sort of the talking heads in the blogosphere, which is not something you see as much anymore, people having their own blog and branding around it. there was a real, again, anxiety, I think, among reporters that we were going to be displaced by people who were effectively taking the information that we were generating as a primary source and just using that as fodder to then, kind of go out and, and interpret the world, which, by the way, is something that journalists have also traditionally done, is interpret the world around us. That is kind of what we do. But there was, I think, this real belief that this was upending the traditional order of things and that it was going to turn traditional reporters into people who had opinions and who were less interested in fact and more interested in assertion. I don't feel that anxiety right now, though. I think that what the past, I would say, 5 or 6 years has really demonstrated to me, particularly as I've gone through my career working in kind of purely digital environments and now being at a much more traditional and more than a century-old news organization, is that reporting still matters, and it matters a great deal. We are still, in many cases, that primary source of information that people turn to, whether they're getting it directly from us or seeing it in an aggregator or getting it from a blogger, if they're still following those, if those are still around. What you allude to in the end of the question that has been the most troubling for me as a reporter is we're also dealing in a media environment now where a lot of consumers of media just don't agree on what the basic facts are, or in some cases seem to not be as interested in fact. So are we perhaps getting more back to what it was like in the early and mid 2000s, where it seemed like everybody had an opinion? And you know what they say about opinions. I won't say it in polite company. Everyone has one. I think this is compounded certainly by the fact that we also have an administration that puts us in the position of being the purveyor of falsehoods to the public and trying to pull one over on people. That is unique in my experience. I mean, maybe David has seen something more like this in previous administrations, but I've never seen one that is as willing to openly, posit us as the enemy of the people, which is literally words that have been used, as you know. Most administrations don't like the media. I think there's generally been a respect for the role of the press, and it seems to me that that is very much in question right now, too. So I guess a lot of my anxieties about what technology is doing to my business or my industry have pretty much subsided. But what technology has done in this way to people's perception of what it is that I and my colleagues are trying to do, and the ability of people to just manipulate information so quickly, that troubles me a great deal.
David?
Well, if you think of this in a segment that begins with Gutenberg inventing the printing press, and we then went through 400 and some odd years in which, in order to be able to actually widely distribute your views, you had to actually own a printing press and own the ink and know how to churn all of this stuff out. And there has always been fake news in the midst of that, and Stalin got this down to a pretty good science, in World War II, and they'd go off and plant news stories in farm newspapers in the United States, or we would in Latin America or in Europe. So there's always been an element of that going on. What's different now is that the internet, which certainly disrupted everything in the industry that we're in, has done a few things. One, it has had the great democratizing effect that you no longer need to own that printing press in order to get your views out. They may only be read by your mother, which is what a lot of those bloggers found out, but at least you can get them out. Makes you feel good. The second thing is, it has turned out to be not only a great research tool, but a great way to connect with your readers. So when I was, in the first 25 years of my time at the Times, you would write a story and you would only know if it was being read if you showed up at a dinner party or cocktail party that night and somebody said, "Oh, I saw your story, you ignorant, useless, whatever," and then you could fill in the rest, right? Now, we've got a great measure of how many people are reading our stories, what countries they're in, how they got there, whether it was through social media. And by the way, more people come to stories on the Times website through social media than come to it by going to the Times app or by going to certainly our homepage. And you have this two-way conversation which is great and empowering, in which people can comment on your story. So they don't have to wait to see if they're at the same dinner party to insult me. They can do it sort of right away. The third thing that's going on, though, is that this has enabled, and President Trump has helped fuel this, the opportunity to try to say that the mainstream media that puts tremendous investment in reporting on these issues is all the same as every individual blogger and so forth. At one moment when then President-elect Trump came to have lunch at the New York Times, yes, he did walk into the New York Times building and called us a national treasure. You haven't seen that happen a whole lot lately. He said at one point during the lunch, well, Breitbart, the New York Times, all like the same thing. Well, we said, no, we don't actually think that what we do is terribly similar to what Breitbart does. The trick now is twofold. First, to have enough of a literacy education among Americans and non-Americans that they can begin to figure out what their sources of information are like. A sort of UL approval of, gee, these people are right significantly more often than they're wrong. And the second thing that I think we need is to make sure that traditional news organizations that are trusted sources, like the Journal, like the Times, like Lawfare, are able to explain to people what they do and how they do it, have enough transparency about this, but also make it clear what their success rates are. And I actually think if you look at the Russia investigation, this has been a golden age for American investigative journalism. Yeah, you've heard a lot about fake news, but if you stack up what the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and most of the networks, wouldn't say all of them, have done on the Russia investigation over the past year, very high degree of accuracy, and brought out news that the government of the United States, or certainly the governing powers in the United States, did not want out. It was only February that we had a White House that was saying no one in the campaign had any contact with Russians, period. Now, my count on Friday was up to 9. I don't know where yours was, Shane. So that is exactly what the founders had in mind. And the trick is, A, can we remind Americans that this is what makes this country different? And secondly, can we get Americans to understand the difference between opinion and reporting?
So Susan, can I tweak the question just a little bit for you, understanding that you work for a different kind of organization? And if I can, because I read Lawfare all the time and I encourage my students to read it. We assigned some of blog posts about 702 for last week's class, but you guys do what I think is a very wonderful job of curating a diverse group of opinions. And yourselves, you write very rigorously, you analyze law and policy. Have you found kind of, it's not a new focus, but a more urgent focus on some of these topics and in your mission this year?
Yeah, so I don't think about sort of the question of bias based on any individual piece in the way sort of news organizations need to. When I write things, I'm not an unbiased individual. I have a point of view and sort of a perspective on things. So what I think about sort of in my editorial capacity is, okay, are we bringing the right range of ideas? And I think that, sort of loosely defined, if we think about, what is our standard for the site or what is sort of our mission, it's, these are the ideas we think you should take seriously. These are the ideas that are worth considering. And sort of one way to, to impose some discipline is to require a certain level of expertise, right? Sort of these are serious people that are talking about these issues. But we really think about it in terms of balance. One thing that has been more of a challenge this year, and I don't know that we're sort of figuring out as we go, is that in the past we've always had sort of a self-balancing ideological masthead, essentially, right? We had conservatives and liberals, and they sort of duked it out amongst themselves, and so the site self-balanced in a way that we never really had to think about, does this seem biased? Now, despite the fact that we have lots of people who identify as conservatives, who are Republicans, who served in prior Republican administrations, by and large, although not unanimously, people feel the same way about this administration. Maybe not about sort of individual people or activities, but sort of they all share a particular level of anxiety about the departure from process that we're seeing, and the ways that that might have some negative impacts on sort of national security issues. And so that has led to a shift in tone. And so our sort of question we had to ask ourselves is, do we want to try and actually think about balancing that tone in a political way, in a way we never had before? Do we want to, go out and try and find people who are willing to defend some of sort of the decisions of this administration, or do we want to just kind of let it be what it is? I think that we've decided to kind of stay the course, and we're open to all ideas. We continue to try and sort of engage with that, but there's, to the extent that there's sort of unanimity about the particular merits of an individual issue, we're going to be committed to taking that issue on, as opposed to sort of trying to maintain nobody can accuse us of being, conservatives or liberals. I have a sort of a little bit of a different perspective coming out from the government as well. So sort of my first real interaction with kind of national security media was as a government attorney, when David and Shane wrote horribly unfair things about us all the time. And so one of the things that I've observed, and it really isn't, it's not a feature of kind of the big daily papers, but it's something that occurs a lot in sort of newer startup, places that are not, Breitbart, real organizations, but online organizations, and that's sort of the advocate journalist, or the journalist especially sort of who's writing about cyber or technology issues in a way that there's a little bit more of a point of view that's being offered in terms of how they're viewing the government activity, or sort of whose side they're falling on. There's a looseness there. And one of the things that and this sort of is really just in my biased individual kind of analyst capacity, is, the importance of journalists applying skepticism to everything. All the information coming out of the government certainly should be viewed with a real healthy dose of skepticism. That's different than viewing everything with the presumption of bad faith. And so I think that what occurs sometimes, especially as you sort of move into these, to outlets in which, sometimes journalists are just younger and greener, or sometimes they have sort of more of this, a little bit more of an advocacy mindset. And the advocacy mindset oftentimes does come from a place of presuming bad faith, particularly on the part of the government or the military or the intelligence community. And the danger of that is that, whenever you can get big FOIA releases or get a story, and if you apply the presumption of bad faith to it throughout, you can end up telling a story that, while not technically inaccurate, is nevertheless untrue. And so I think that's one thing, and I think about that more as a media consumer, both inside the government and out. Sort of, how do we both applaud and support that skepticism, right? People, you shouldn't just be stenographers for what the government says. I think it's, if anything of the past sort of year has proven the importance of like a good critical media, but how do we make sure that we haven't crossed the line into advocacy such that we aren't really understanding what's going on anymore because we're getting the journalist or the outlet sort of filter put on top of things.
So on that point of a good critical media, all of you write about or analyze some really significant stories that have been mentioned involving cyber conflict. Obviously, the Russia investigation. David, you in the New York Times have done a whole lot of work on the US's use of our cyber capabilities to thwart the nuclear threat of North Korea. Now, the use of unidentified or anonymous sources in reporting is certainly not a new thing. Neither is the use sometimes of classified information. So I'm wondering to David and Shane, and then Susan, I'll be very interested on your view on this, given your background coming from the NSA, but what are your personal practices or ethics? First, let's take it one at a time. First of all, with respect to anonymous sources. Using those, how do you deal with anonymous source? What kind of processes do you go through to verify the reliability of that source and or the information he or she may be providing?
Well, I think for readers, I think anonymous sources are often very frustrating, and I should be clear that I think for journalists, it's also frustrating to us when we want to put something in the paper and attribute it to someone, but that source is simply unwilling to let us identify him or her by name. I think that, and David probably will agree with me on this, that it tends to be an unavoidable element of our tradecraft as national security reporters. There are other areas, perhaps when you're writing about politics or healthcare policy, where not only is it not as advisable to use so many anonymous sources, but in many cases editors won't let you use them. But there tends to be, I think, an exception that is made in this area, largely because if we could not cite anonymous sources, we would not really be able to write very much. I mean, it would really reduce our ability to put out information that we think people need to know. So what goes on behind, the best way I can describe this is what you see in print when you see US official or a person familiar with the matter or someone briefed on the investigation. Two things to keep in mind there. One is that at organizations like the Journal, like the Times and the Post and other large media organizations, there is a lot of process going on behind that sort of veil of anonymity, both on the part of the reporter doing due diligence and applying his or her many years of experience to understand whether that source is credible, verifying those claims, and then certainly in the case of the Journal, a very rigorous process that goes on with editors before anything goes into print to, in some extent, almost interrogate the reporter in some cases as to not necessarily who are your sources by name, but why are you confident in this? You know, how many people did you talk to? Give us some sense of the process, such that by the time it gets out into the world, there's kind of a quality assurance process that I think that has gone on there. And, you know, we stake our reputations on it. That's ultimately why, you know, when we put that byline on there on the story, it's not just a point of pride, it's also a point of accountability. If it's wrong, it's coming back on us individually. So I've certainly grown accustomed to using sources in that way, and when we get them on the record, it's great. But, you know, I think the public should have some confidence that we are not simply making these things up. And certainly I can say in the case of my newsroom, you know, I don't know exactly how you would do it because we're sort of getting checked from multiple different angles. But, you know, it's a necessary element of what we do, I think.
It's necessary for you to inform the public.
Yeah,
Is that,
exactly.
would you say that?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, without anonymous sources, you wouldn't be reading very much in our pages.
Now, it's overused. And so I want to make sure that people in the room understand there's sort of two kinds of, when you see a senior government official said, there are at least two flavors. There are really many flavors, but I'll give you the, not the Baskin and Robbins version, but just the chocolate and vanilla version here. So every administration regularly briefs reporters every single day with the requirement that this is listed as a senior administration official, a senior State Department official, senior Pentagon official, so forth and so on. We had a hilarious day back in March when the president one night tweeted that no one should ever believe a story that was based entirely on anonymous sources. It was right after one of the Russia ones. And the next morning, the White House, they said, there'll be a background briefing on the president's next plan to do X. And everybody said, well, wait a minute, the president just said we can't believe any anonymous sources, right? Wasn't it? So their immediate sense was, no, that's not about, you know, official sanctioned anonymous sources. Most of the time, those background briefings do not need to be on background, and we regularly protest trying to get them on the record. And it's usually people who just don't want to be held personally accountable for a government policy, particularly if it's a government policy they may not personally subscribe to. So that's variety one. Variety two is what you're thinking of from watching the movies, you know. When Shane meets somebody in a parking lot. I assume he does that to get documents. I've done this now for 35 years. I've never once had met a source in a parking lot, but I aspire to it before I, you know. But it makes for really good movie scenes. No, in national security, people are walking a couple of fine lines. Number one, there are real whistleblowers, people who might be protected by the whistleblower law, but are giving you information, documents, whatever, because they're trying to right a wrong. That vision may be entirely in their head. Edward Snowden thought that he was revealing awful things that Susan and her former colleagues at the NSA were doing in surveillance of the American people. Allegedly, right? She can't acknowledge that those documents were true. And I think a lot of us who looked at these documents thought there were some that raised some questions and that forced President Obama at the time to make some changes, including in the warrantless wiretapping program, where the NSA was collecting some set of data about almost all phone calls in the country. It doesn't mean they were going through them all. He changed the practice after it came out. He changed the practice of how we listen to foreign leaders because of what came out. But by and large, I think you'd say that Snowden probably didn't reveal much that was beyond what we thought the government was or should be doing. Then there's the category of people who talk to you about a program that they believe needs some public airing. And in cyber, and I'll finish on this thought, I think there is far, far too much secrecy. Now, why is that? Because it's one of, not the only weapon, but one of the most prominent weapons that came up out of the intelligence agencies, and therefore was wrapped in secrecy from the beginning. We have had ways of talking about nuclear policy, deterrence, our nuclear capabilities since Hiroshima forward without describing the classified details of how you make bombs or who's got the authority to go launch them or where you store them. In the area of drones, when Obama came into office, you couldn't use that word inside the White House press room because the lawyers wouldn't let anybody use the word drones. The president gave a series of speeches. It took him a few years to get there, to move part of this program out of the black world and into the military world, and began to discuss the conditions under which we would use unmanned vehicles in hopes that we would begin to set some standards that the rest of the world would also follow. In cyber, President Obama and President Trump so far never brought themselves to go do that, other than to say we have some major capabilities. And I don't know how we can expect that we're going to have a national debate or even a debate among the elites in this room about how we want to use and not use these weapons until we lift some of that veil of secrecy around them.
So let me just briefly follow up before going to Susan. So do you have a theory on why cyber has been, shrouded in secrecy in a way that you haven't seen in other kinds of very significant weapon policy issues?
Well, I think part of it is, of course, that people immediately think two things. One, if we discuss our capabilities, we're going to be losing a good deal of our advantage. That may be true against some adversaries, although I think the Russians, the Chinese, probably the North Koreans and the Iranians have a pretty good sense of what our capabilities are. Secondly, a lot of our capabilities have leaked for reasons that have nothing to do with the media. The Stuxnet virus didn't get revealed by the New York Times or anybody else. It leaked out. There were copies of the code. So when we got ready to write about the decision-making process, and I went to the government and said, here's what we're going to discuss, the first thing I said was, if you want me to withhold something, if you want to make an argument, which, by the way, is the news organization's decision, not the government's decision, realize that's something that doesn't sit well with everybody. But if you want to do that, the bar is going to be pretty high because you're going to have to explain to me why I was revealing something the Iranians didn't already know because you or your allies managed to make a mistake that gave them the code. Okay, so that's a next one up. But I think the main reason is that the U.S. still perceives itself rightly to have an advantage in this arena. And so it's not likely to get into a big public discussion until it probably feels that somebody else has an advantage in this arena.
So Susan, having served in government and now having a very different kind of public role, how do you look at very informative stories that use anonymous sources?
So, look, I sort of bifurcate the work of investigative journalism. I also think not all, the sort of, we shouldn't conflate anonymous sources with classified information, and also not all leaks of classified information are alike. So, right, this is a pretty complex sphere to operate in. One of the things that we've set for ourselves as a publication, and we can do this because it's not sort of a journalist outlet, it's a different form of analysis, is that we don't publish classified information. We will link to, we'll link to something that hosts the stolen documents. We don't put them on the site. We really do that because we know what our traffic looks like, and we want to sort of keep faith with our readers. We know that lots of people are sitting in government office buildings in a way that, were they to open up a website that had classified information on it, that could put them in a difficult position. So that's just sort of, we haven't felt the
Some of those people do go to nytimes.com and wallstreetjournal.com, but still.
So this has led, so the sort of the question of what to do with leaked classified information actually, I think has, needs to be addressed in the government. I mean, you hear sort of absurd stories about, the New York Times being stored in a skiff, and you can't read this if it's still classified, things that are sort of out there. I don't know that the government has yet fully decided how it wants to treat this information after it's leaked. One thing that people who write for us have to be really careful about, particularly former government officials, people who formerly held clearances, is just because information has leaked out into the public, that doesn't mean that it's been confirmed. And so you have to be really careful whenever something sort of becomes public knowledge, especially whenever it's a partial piece, right? It usually comes out like a little bit, that you don't want to actually make the situation worse. You don't want to inadvertently confirm something. So that requires sort of a level of care. We do have a pretty grotesque overclassification problem within the government. And I actually think that's something that has operational impacts. I would imagine a lot of people in this room have had the experience of not being able to access the information that they need to because of sort of baffling classification decisions. That there are real operational impacts here. And so I think that sort of cyber has, because it was sort of originally developed within, a lot of the capabilities were originally developed within the intelligence community, because there's a fear that, look, if somebody knows that you have a missile, that doesn't necessarily change, that doesn't change their ability to prevent you from dropping it on them, right? This is a little bit, the need to preserve asymmetric information it sort of has different operational equities here. That said, for as long as the government endures in overclassifying lots and lots of information, I think you are going to see sort of a persistent leaking out of this stuff, because sort of, I think the way to think about it, and a scholar, David Posen, has written quite a bit on this, is it's an ecosystem, and leaks are a way of sort of correcting failures in this process. And when the national security community requires that you have to get buy-in from the American public, and obviously some things remain secret, but if they don't have enough information to be fundamentally exercising a democratic choice, that's damage, and so these leaks will occur as a way to sort of root around it. So we've, very much sort of sidestep that by just saying, okay, we'll link to the work that you guys are doing, but not host it ourselves. But I do think it sort of gets to a larger conversation that's not just one for journalists to think about, but actually sort of for the national security community also to think about sort of how we're going to treat this stuff moving forward.
Sure. So obviously, the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times doesn't have the same policy as Lawfare. Nevertheless, as responsible media organizations, I imagine you are put in a position, you yourselves or your editors, of determining what is in the public interest. If you get a source or documents show up somehow on your desks or in your inbox that have classified information in them, you have to make a choice about what is in the public knowledge, or what is good for the public knowledge to inform the public, and what, by potentially disclosing, could have some real harm on our national security interests, on the very lives of individuals? How do you make those kinds of choices?
Well, I think David put it well when he said, with the reporting around Stuxnet, going to the government and essentially saying, I'm willing to engage with you in a conversation about your concerns about what would happen if this information is published. But also, I think as reporters, we need to have a pretty clear sense going into that where we are going to set that bar, which is not to say that that bar can't be moved and we can't be persuaded that something it would be not in the public interest if we reported it. But I think you start by giving the government a chance to make its case, and knowing that if you're going to report on sensitive and classified matters, just as a matter of basic fairness and basic process as journalists, we go to the government to get their response and engage in that conversation. I think there's a fairly standard set of assumptions that if a credible case is made that lives will be put in jeopardy, you take that far more seriously than if it would just be something that is politically embarrassing to an administration. If you have reason to believe that laws are being broken, obviously that is going to argue in the extreme for publishing that information, and it would be hard to see how the government could make a case that that shouldn't be brought to light. A lot of this, though, it gets into some more subjective territory, and I think what's been challenging in this administration is, to be quite candid, to what degree do we believe that people in the administration who are arguing against us publishing certain things are credible sources of information in their own right, or whether they are simply acting in a much more of a political capacity to try and prevent us from publishing things. And in my interactions, I guess my bar has been set pretty high lately on when we decide to go forward with classified information. But generally speaking, I do think that people on this beat take it seriously and know that when we are revealing these internal workings of government, it is a different kind of revelation than when you're talking about internal policymaking around a piece of legislation or something that doesn't necessarily have the ability to impact life and death decisions.
When I first came to Washington, we'd have a couple of cases like this a year where we're dealing with the government on a sensitive issue and using the kind of standards that you just heard Shane describe. If something is going to risk a life, an imminent military operation, an imminent intelligence operation, the government can make a very concrete case for damage. And sometimes we've held stories for a long time. I held a story for 3 years about a secret US program to help secure Pakistan's nuclear weapons, because the Bush administration, up to and including the president, made a very persuasive case to us that it would reveal to the Taliban vulnerabilities in the Pakistani nuclear program that nobody had a benefit from knowing. And we believed that, and actually by the time we published the information, a very senior person said, "Oh God, are you still holding that story? You could have run that a year ago." But that's another risk that you run in these. So it's important to have that conversation. But the government's got to know a few things. First, you go into those conversations with a presumption to publish. Second, the fact that something is classified should not, to a journalist, be dispositive in any way. There's a lot of overclassification. WikiLeaks was a really great example of this. I was part of the team that went through the 250,000 State Department cables on WikiLeaks. They were all classified pretty much at the secret level, a few top secret, but they weren't classified anywhere near the way, say, the Snowden documents were later on. I would say 15% of the total trove were newspaper articles that someone in some country working for an embassy saw, thought somebody in Washington should read, stamped secret on it, and sent it on, even though you could Google it that same day. Now, we are not going to automatically respect a system in which things we write could get stamped secret and suddenly you couldn't go publish them. I mean, it's a crazy, and we all know, everybody in this room knows the degree to which overclassification is a problem, because no one's ever gotten fired for overclassifying, but lots of people have gotten fired for underclassifying. So we go into these discussions with the government having to make the case, not whether it's classified or not, but what the specific damage would be. And that's a hard thing to go do. There's a third element to this, which is to have that conversation. People sometimes say to me, look, if I'm going to talk to you about what the damage is going to be, I'm actually going to have to go violate secrecy here by having a conversation with you about the material you've had, even if I don't on the record confirm that it's true. It's a very difficult conversation. And we say to them in response, yeah, that's exactly right. That's what you're going to have to do. So you're going to have to go up your chain of command and get permission to go do that. And we're watching carefully how high in the chain of command it is that the New York Times gets a request to withhold something. If it's a truly sensitive matter and the people who are concerned about it can't get the attention of the National Security Advisor or the CIA director or the Director of National Intelligence or whatever to make that call to a senior editor of the paper, we have to go assume that it actually isn't quite as high a priority as the people who've been talking to us want to say it is.
Susan, do you have something?
Yeah, so just to sort of add, I think, one, it's important to sort of think about that we're having this conversation sort of from the end point or the sort of journalism perspective. I still think it's important to, consider constructing a process in which, whenever people decide to reveal this information, even information that's been revealed in the past year that, where people are a little bit more enthusiastic about sort of governmental leaks, that, one person substituting their judgment for the judgment of a system, right? So even if somebody can say, I think there's an overclassification problem, there's always sort of a concern about people taking that as license to, oh good, then I can exercise my personal judgment about whether or not this should be classified or not, when you don't actually have all of the relevant and necessary information. The other sort of thing that we're seeing, and I think this is particularly a feature, David mentioned WikiLeaks, but sort of in the era of mass doxing or mass leaks. And that's the way in which the public seems to especially value information that's been leaked, regardless of sort of the underlying newsworthiness of it. So obviously the DNC hacked emails and sort of John Podesta's risotto recipe is a particularly good example of that sort of the public, when information comes out to the public through a hack or a leak, there's like a presumption that there's something that somebody was trying to hide, right? It's extra interesting because somebody was trying to hide it. And I actually think that if we go, if we think about how did we get to sort of the election interference DNC model, we have to go back all the way sort of to Sony, really, where you have all of these emails coming out into the public and the media really ravenously reporting on it because it's secret and it's gossipy without ever sort of thinking about, what is the source of this information? How are we covering it? Are we putting it in context? Is it newsworthy, separate and apart from being part of this leak? And so I think that what's occurred, and it occurs both with classified information and also just with sort of this hacked information, is that instead of something being evaluated for being genuinely newsworthy, it becomes automatically newsworthy by virtue of having been included sort of in these troves of information, and how that can be actually sort of weaponized against political campaigns, U.S. corporations and the U.S. government as well.
So I'd like to switch gears slightly and cover one last question before opening it up to the audience for questions. But it follows along well with classified information and leakers. A leaker, one who is a government employee who has signed non-disclosure documents, who has been given a clearance, if that individual leaks information, they are subject to disciplinary action, including criminal prosecution. Now, a journalist or a media outlet has never been prosecuted for publishing classified information. However, in a briefing about the prosecution of leaks given by Attorney General Sessions in August of 2017, he made a statement about the intent of the Department of Justice to revisit policies affecting media subpoenas. And let me read it, it's very brief. He said, and I'm quoting, I have listened to career investigators and prosecutors about how to most successfully investigate and prosecute these matters. At their suggestion, one of the things we are doing is reviewing policies affecting media subpoenas. We respect the important role that the press plays and will give them respect, but it is not unlimited. They cannot place lives at risk with impunity. We must balance their role with protecting our national security and the lives of those who serve in our intelligence community, the armed forces, and all law-abiding Americans. How did you interpret this statement? This is to all of you, and I'm interested if you or your news organizations changed practices, hired more lawyers. What are your thoughts?
I'm not sure we could hire more lawyers. One of the interesting things about this, just so people understand the process, and I'll describe in a second what the DOJ has done so far, is that if we're in a really sensitive story, we'll probably bring the lawyers in early on in the reporting. It's not as if you go about, you do your thing, you write your story, and then you hand it to a lawyer and you say, what do you think? Because you're going to try to arrange your reporting and your writing along the way to avoid putting sources in legal jeopardy, something lawyers are very good at helping us go do, at trying to see what you can actually get from the public record, which complicates the issue for the government as they're prosecuting it, and to make sure that you have done your best in your own practices to make sure there isn't much around if the Justice Department comes around to go do that kind of investigation. So extremely important in how you handle the notes issues you take, that you have a regular process for getting rid of those notes, for destroying them, because it's not an option after you get a subpoena that you're going to go destroy. I guess it is an option depending on who's, but it seems from reading the news like
Not
it
a wise one.
gets people in trouble. But if you have a regular process for disgorging this stuff, then you're in a different place. The DOJ's rules until now have been that if they're doing a leak investigation, they would go to all of the possible sources before they come to the reporter. And I've been involved in major stories where hundreds of people have been interviewed about whether or not they spoke with me or so forth and so on, but the FBI and DOJ never came to go talk to me. Because once they do that, they know it triggers a whole set of other issues. Now, the Supreme Court's been pretty clear that there is no absolute right to go protect your sources. And that came down in my colleague Jim Risen's case, although in that case, having won their point, the government then did not call Mr. Risen.
Right.
We are not on great legal ground should the government decide to go revise the policy as Attorney General Sessions has suggested.
Yeah, I would actually, you asked my response to what his statement was, and to some degree, I actually would credit him with being honest about what the position probably has been of previous Justice Departments as well. Mm-hmm. I mean, going back to the Bush administration, the Obama administration, there was an instance in which the Department of Justice subpoenaed phone records from the Associated Press without notifying them that they were going to do this, which was a violation of internal DOJ guidelines. I mean, a lot of reporters, and I counsel more junior national security reporters in our bureau about this, have operated under the false presumption, as David points out, that we have some kind of a press shield that means that there is a confidentiality privilege between us and our sources analogous to one that doctors have with patients or that attorneys have with clients. And I think any honest reading of the Supreme Court's decision on these and subsequent appellate court rulings is that no, we don't, and that we may want to believe that we do, and that we may have been operating in practice in this country like we do, but it doesn't take that much for a Justice Department or a prosecutor to decide. Well, I shouldn't say it's not a trivial matter, as David points out, but you can do it. You can come to a reporter for these things. So, we need to take steps on the front end to ensure that if that ever does come to pass, we've protected our sources to the best of our ability. And every reporter at some point has to also ask himself or herself that question: does that mean that I would be willing to risk jail time or significant fines if I were found in contempt of a subpoena.
Yeah, so I think that sort of echoing on Shane's point, this is an issue, people have taken particular note with sort of Attorney General Sessions. This is an issue that prior administrations have grappled with. There are actually sort of two issues that are implicit in your question. One is the question of whether or not, when the government is conducting essentially an internal leak investigation, can you subpoena reporters or pierce that confidentiality? I think Eric Holder learned that actually that's a pretty fraught path, and it's one that I think prior attorney generals have learned, like, whatever the ultimate legal questions there, like, it's probably better not to go down. The second is whether or not a reporter or journalist could be prosecuted under the Espionage Act for the publication, not necessarily the publication, although possibly the publication, but also the solicitation of classified materials. And journalists have to be really careful about whether or not they are in receipt, sort of passive receipt of materials, or if actually they're asking a source to go get materials, then they've potentially have more serious sort of legal issues. That might seem like sort of even asking the question might seem like sort of an anathema to First Amendment principles, but it becomes really, really complicated whenever you start to think about, well, is WikiLeaks a news organization? Are we going to extend them, right? So the CIA director has said they are a hostile, non-state intelligence agency, essentially. And so whenever we start to think about the ways people are using the ambiguity of media that you talked about in your first question with getting large amounts of classified information, the linchpin of the Espionage Act prosecutions is really intent. Do you intend to harm national security? If we start to have quasi-media organizations that the government believes they can prove in court possess things like necessary intent, then I do think we might have to face really, really difficult questions about whether or not you want to let certain things at the margins go in order to preserve sort of that core First Amendment freedom, essentially.
So we've got a little under 13 minutes left. Let's take some questions from the audience.
Major Toronto from the Air Force. Last year, Senator Portman introduced the Countering Information Warfare Act. My question's about fake news. This ended up in law in the NDAA of 2017, which created a new government entity called the Global Engagement Center, the GEC. And the purposes of the GEC, one is to label fake news based on some criteria. Two is to issue fact-based narratives, I guess, of various editions of true facts from the government. So my question is for any and all of you, where in the world do you think this is going, and how is it going to affect journalism to have a government entity be out there labeling what is legitimate, what's illegitimate? And two, could this label of fake news equate to arguably an unconstitutional presumptive license on the free press?
Oof. On the second question, I would defer to the lawyer on that one, but that's a really interesting question. My first instinct is to say, on the one hand, I'm not sure how persuaded people would be if a story from the Journal or the Times got the government seal of approval as true news, whether they would take much stock in that. I'm more concerned about the idea of the government going around and somehow putting the good housekeeping seal of disapproval on things. I think that actually that we as journalists are rather well equipped to do that on our own. I also am of the view that social media platforms should be doing more to flag or to filter what goes onto their platforms. That's a very fraught process, I understand it. But there a little assistance to consumers of media when they are on a place like Facebook or Twitter and maybe incorrectly presume that what they're seeing must be true because after all it's written down, might not be such a bad thing. But I'm just sort of instinctively queasy about the government playing that role.
I don't think the U.S. government is constitutionally well set up to play that role, but more importantly, I'm not sure who would believe it. I mean, before this legislation came out, the State Department created some global engagement centers to try to turn out these kind of narratives. And, it came across a little bit like, reading one of those government safety manuals, as you can imagine. It was sort of not meeting people who were going to be recruited by ISIS where they might actually go be. And so we're not terribly good at this. And I'm even queasy about the government funding something like Voice of America and so forth, which I think over the years did some really great work, but it's very hard to explain to outsiders why Voice of America is the voice of truth and RT, or Xinhua is not.
Yeah, so I'm not a First Amendment lawyer, although my instinct is that the government is itself a speech actor, and so they are allowed to say we think things are true or not true. The area in which sort of issues begin to arise is whenever they try and control or restrain other people's ability to sort of to speak. So I think to the extent it's the government just labeling things as we think this is true or we don't think this is true. I don't know that raises constitutional issues. You might have endorsement issues, right? The government actually isn't able to endorse one media outlet over the other. So you might have sort of complex issues related to that. In terms of whether or not it's a good idea, the best way for the government, I think the best way for the government to sort of be participants in this space is to work really hard on preserving their own credibility. And that doesn't just mean not actively lying. It also means working to get the facts right. And whenever sort of a false narrative emerges, or people are, or the government itself has made a mistake, sort of working to correct that and be really candid about it. Because I think that there already is such a credibility deficit that's not just related to this president. I mean, it's a long-standing sort of rift between the American people and the government about how sort of candid they've been. And so a little bit my instinct is the government needs to get its own house in order and sort of focus on how to bolster and reinforce and rebuild their relationship with the American people and the American media before focusing on sort of labeling things fake news or true news. That said, sort of disinformation is a huge issue. It would be foolish to just say, well, we don't want to run afoul of the First Amendment, so we're going to pretend as though this isn't a real issue. It isn't a national security issue. It isn't something we need to really take seriously.
John Schneider, Booz Allen Hamilton. Question for the journalists here is bringing the focus back to journalism and cyber conflict in the realm of news aggregators like Google News or other aggregation points where news is brought forward to the consumer from a variety of sources, large media venues, as well as the blogosphere and independent reporting. Where do you see the burden for assessing the accuracy or perhaps the credibility of news outlets in the aggregation space? Because we have experienced where fake news or false news or disinformation is being injected into the news cycles and news flows and automatically aggregated for the benefit of the consumer in such a rapid and voluminous way that we as consumers of that information have no ability to discern between the truth and the gray, as opposed to clearly false information. So is there a need for a mechanism for independent organizations to be vetted for their credibility, or is that on the aggregators, or is it just caveat emptor?
You're beginning to see some people think about ways to go do this. Steve Brill, who started off American Lawyer, and some others, has got an interesting startup he's just beginning to discuss that would help do an evaluation of the validity of different news sources that he could sort of sell and package. You're seeing journalistic organizations begin to think about that. And in the hearings last week, you heard Facebook, Twitter, and Google begin to be questioned about whether or not they can simply be regarded as a pipe through which everything runs, or do they begin to think about what they call content moderation and what we call editing, okay? So they started down that line a few years ago without realizing it. Everybody was in agreement they shouldn't be a conduit for child pornography. They built algorithms to cut out child pornography. Then everybody got to agree that they shouldn't be a conduit for beheading videos. fairly easy to figure out what's a beheading video, although it did require a 24/7 team at YouTube to make sure they were taking these things out. Then they had to begin to make more subtle judgments. Somebody banned the iconic photograph of that girl running away from napalm in Vietnam, where she's running naked down the street. And it was banned, I think, on Facebook, although I may have this wrong, because the terms of service said we don't run naked photographs of underage people. So it got taken out until somebody had to come back and say, well, this is slightly different. This is a historic photograph of political significance that came to symbolize one of the outrages of the Vietnam War. And they gathered a committee together and said, okay, we're going to permit this one as an exception to our rule. And I remember saying to one of my friends there at the time, guys, you've just gone into the editing business. You may not have thought it when you were gathering this, but you now have. And the Russia case is now going to force them to do that at a vastly larger scale, because they not only have to worry about content, they have to worry about who was the originator, the creator of the content. So while it might be perfectly okay for anybody in this room to utter an opinion about Black Lives Matter or Texas succession or whatever within your First Amendment rights, we might view that differently if we think it's coming from a bunch of bots created outside of Leningrad.
Yes, I worry a little bit that there's, although I think the focus in asking these questions and focus on technology companies is appropriate, that there's an over-focus there, particularly on the Hill, because that's the easy thing to tackle right now, right? You can regulate something. Clearly what we're up against is a crisis of civics education, of sort of basic media literacy. And so thinking about how are we going to create a generation that understands how to evaluate sort of information for itself, evaluate the validity of a news article in this environment, that's a much more difficult question that requires a lot of long-term investment and thinking. I think that's probably where the genuine answers lie. And so I a little bit worry that that's too hard, that's too big of a piece to take on, and so, let's try and kind of regulate this surface area, because it feels easier and it feels like making progress.
I can just jump on that one too. I remember it just very quickly in my 4th grade class, we literally had a class in how to read the newspaper. And it was something that was both an indoctrination of sorts to kids to try and create media literacy, but it was also to try and encourage kids to understand where valid information came from. I don't know why there couldn't be something analogous like that in classrooms and certainly in living rooms, where you just teach kids, this is the kind of information you can trust and this is stuff you should be suspicious about.
If you're not teaching that in your own living room, there's an issue.
Yeah.
Ma'am, gentlemen, Cadet Johnson, West Point class of 2019. My question for you three is that you all spoke to that you agree about an overclassification problem within the United States and especially within the intelligence community. So my question to you would be, what exactly would you propose to fix the overclassification problem, and what would a world in which an overclassification problem is fixed would look like?
If you want to read the best single book on this, it was Daniel Patrick Moynihan wrote a book about 20 years ago called Secrecy that remains today the best single explanation of the bureaucratic dynamic here. And I think we've got the whole thing backwards, and we have to sort of think that there is a small collection, a very small collection, a tiny collection of things that the government of the United States really needs to go and protect, and amass those things and work on protecting them. Because whatever you think about what our reporting is, I would say that the government's ability, from WikiLeaks to Snowden to shadow brokers and so forth and so on, to protect its own secrets is less than impressive in recent years. So I think they have to start from that with an assumption that most things are unclassified, where you have to make the case for them to be classified, rather than the automatic stamping that so many people in this room, I'm sure, have had to go through the process of doing. And so we've got to change our mindset entirely about what the purpose of this is.
So look, this is an incredibly difficult question. General Clapper, whenever he became DNI, this is something he took really seriously. He undertook a lot of studies of the intelligence community, sort of supporting the ICAP review board, and so tried over a period of a number of years to really kind of tackle this issue, and made relatively little progress, I think, on the outcome, or certainly less than he had expected to. So the idea that like this is an easy thing, no, this is something that people at the top have taken seriously and really tried to get their arms around. I think one of the answers is going to be that, and this is something that David alluded to in an earlier question, whenever somebody is making that original classification decision, everybody knows if you make the decision a mistake in one direction and you err towards overclassification, there's not any set of consequences there. But if you accidentally make something unclassified or share something that is classified in an unclassified way, there are serious consequences. And so what we're going to have to do is think about how you change the incentive structures. So the person who's making that first original decision is really incentivized appropriately to not just want to say, all right, I'm going to put a stamp on this no matter what. I don't know if the answer is sort of, punishing people, or I don't think that's what it is, but sort of it's changing the thinking that occurs at that moment that I think is going to have the kind of largest impact.
One final offering, I would say, if the government really was undertaking an honest, truly honest and objective assessment of what the damage was when information is exposed, we play a role in that, because you could go back and try to honestly assess what the damage was done after classified information appeared in the pages of either of our papers or elsewhere. And I would bet that most of the time they would find that the damage was not that great or was less severe than people feared it might be.
So on that note, we are out of time. Please join me in thanking our panelists. I have a small gift for you.